I've never been the type to celebrate my accomplishments, a trait my therapist says I should work on. But tonight was different. After 5 years of sleepless nights, skipped weekends, and an unhealthy relationship with caffeine, Palmer Technologies finally recognized my value. Senior Systems Engineer. Just saying it felt surreal, like slipping into a dress you've been eyeing for years only to find it fits perfectly. The glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor had been transformed from its usual sterile environment into something almost festive. Blue and silver balloons, company colors, floated against the ceiling, while waitstaff in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's skyline twinkled against the darkening sky, lights reflecting in puddles left by the afternoon rain. Marcus, my immediate supervisor and mentor for the last 3 years, clinked his glass against mine. To Willow Parker, the woman who single-handedly saved the Richardson account with that brilliant override system, this promotion is long overdue. I felt my cheeks flush as several colleagues turned to offer congratulations. My team had gathered, Aiden with his characteristic smirk that somehow never seemed condescending. Priya, who had brought me coffee during those late nights when I was troubleshooting the system failure, and even Derek from accounting, who barely spoke to anyone, but had sent me a surprisingly heartfelt email that morning. "Speech!" someone called out, and suddenly all eyes were on me. Public speaking had never been my forte, yet another thing I'd been working on with Dr. Winters during our Tuesday sessions. I cleared my throat, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. 5 years ago, I walked into this building convinced they'd made a mistake in hiring me, I began, smiling as several colleagues chuckled knowingly. Imposter syndrome was practically part of the onboarding package at Palmer. But thanks to all of you, especially you, Marcus, I found my place here. This promotion isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who picked up my slack when my code wouldn't cooperate or who listened to me ramble about algorithmic solutions at lunch. I paused, scanning the room for one particular face, knowing I wouldn't find it. I'm grateful to be celebrating with my work family tonight. As if on cue, the elevator dinged and I turned, expecting to see another colleague arriving fashionably late. Instead, I froze, my champagne flute nearly slipping from my fingers. Tiffany Parker stood framed in the doorway, as if the universe had heard my pointed omission and decided to play a cruel joke. My mother was dressed impeccably as always. A cream Chanel suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, pearls. Gleaming at her neck and ears, her ash-blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. At 58, she still commanded attention when she entered a room, her posture perfect from years of dance training she'd abandoned but never unlearned. "Willow, darling," she called, voice carrying across the suddenly quieter room. "I'm not." Too late for the celebration, am I? I hadn't expected her to come. In fact, I'd only sent the invitation as a formality, the same way I sent Christmas cards to distant relatives, an empty gesture with no expectation of response. The last time we'd spoken had been my birthday 3 months ago, a tense 15-minute call where she'd managed to question my career choices, my single status, and my decision to cut my hair all before asking how I actually was. Marcus glanced at me with raised eyebrows. I'd mentioned my complicated relationship with my mother in vague terms during after-work drinks, but I'd never elaborated on the details. How could I explain that Tiffany Parker had spent my entire childhood grooming me for a life I never wanted? Ballet lessons, pageants, etiquette classes, all intended to shape me into the proper society wife she'd been before she'd married into tech money, only to be discarded when a younger model came along. "Mom," I managed, forcing a smile as I crossed the room. "This is a surprise." Her perfume, always Chanel No. 5, enveloped me as she air-kissed both my cheeks. "I wouldn't miss my only daughter's special day," she said, though we both knew that wasn't true. She'd missed my college graduation, claiming a migraine. She'd missed my first apartment warming, my 30th birthday, and countless other milestones that didn't align with her vision for my life. Let me introduce you, I said, guiding her toward Marcus, who extended his hand politely. Marcus Chen, Senior Director of Engineering, he introduced himself. Your daughter is the backbone of our department, Mrs. Parker. Ms. Parker, she corrected, smoothly. I reverted to my maiden name after the divorce. And yes, Willow has always been quite technically minded. Even as a child, she was always taking things apart. I had hoped she'd channel that analytical thinking into law like her grandfather, but she trailed off with a small sigh that spoke volumes. I felt my smile freeze, the familiar weight of her disappointment settling on my shoulders. Some things never changed. I'd spent years in therapy trying to unlearn the need for her approval, yet here I was, 32 years old, and still flinching at her subtle jabs. Actually, Mom, that technical mind just earned me a senior position. I'll be leading my own team now. She smiled thinly. How nice. And what exactly does a senior systems engineer do? Is that similar to IT support? Before I could respond, Priya appeared at my side, her timing impeccable as always. Willow designed the security protocol that 3 major tech companies have now licensed, she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp behind her glasses. Her work is revolutionizing how encrypted data is processed across networks. My mother blinked, clearly not expecting someone to jump to my defense. How interesting, she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. And you are? Priya Sharma, lead software architect, my friend replied, extending her hand. Your daughter mentored me when I first joined the company. She has quite the reputation here. I see, my mother said, taking a champagne flute from a passing server. And is that why there's such a casual atmosphere? In my experience, corporate events usually have a certain standard. I followed her gaze around the room, seeing it through her critical eyes, the blue and silver balloons that suddenly seemed childish, the catered food that wasn't quite upscale enough, my colleagues in their business casual attire rather than formal wear. What had felt comfortable and celebratory moments ago now seemed inadequate. Palmer has a relaxed culture, I explained, hating the defensive note that had crept into my voice. We believe good work speaks for itself without the need for pretense. She hummed, taking a sip of champagne. I suppose that's one approach. The evening continued in much the same vein, my mother making subtle comments that undermined my accomplishments while charming everyone around her. It was a skill she'd perfected over decades, this ability to seem gracious while wielding words, like precision instruments. By the time she cornered me near the dessert table an hour later, I was emotionally exhausted. Willow, darling, have you given any thought to what this promotion means for your personal life? She asked, delicately, selecting a chocolate-covered strawberry. You're already working such long hours. When will you find time to meet someone suitable? Start a family? I stabbed at my cheesecake with more force than necessary. Mom, not everyone wants the same things you did at my age. Perhaps not, but time doesn't stop for career ambitions. Dear, you're 32. I'm aware of my age, thanks. She sighed dramatically. I'm only thinking of your happiness, Willow. Look at your cousin Jennifer, married to that wonderful surgeon, 2 beautiful children, and she still maintains her position at the foundation. Balance is possible. Jennifer's foundation position was arranged by her father-in-law, I pointed out. And she has a full-time nanny. That's not balance, that's privilege. Don't be bitter, darling. It doesn't suit you. She patted my arm condescendingly. Speaking of family, have you heard the news about Palmer Technologies? There's quite the shakeup happening at the executive level. I frowned, momentarily distracted. What news? Oh, I assumed you'd know working here. The board is bringing in new leadership. Dominic Richards is taking over as CEO next month. The name hit me like a physical blow. My fork clattered against the plate. Dominic Richards, I repeated, my voice hollow. You mean your father, yes. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction at having delivered this bombshell. Isn't it interesting how life works out? All these years you've been building your career at the very company he's now going to run, almost as if you were trying to get his attention. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Dominic Richards, the man whose DNA I carried, but who had been absent from my life since I was 7 years old. The man who had walked away from our family for a vice president position in London, sending birthday cards and Christmas gifts that gradually tapered off as he built a new family across the ocean. The man whose abandonment had shaped my childhood, and whose success had cast a shadow over my career choices. And now, he would be my boss's boss's boss. Did he know? I asked, the question scraping my suddenly dry throat. Did he know I worked here when he took the position? My mother tilted, her head studying me with the calculating look I knew too well. I couldn't say. We don't exactly keep in touch. Though I did run into his wife, his current wife, at a charity event last month. She mentioned they were relocating to Seattle. I thought perhaps you might have reached out to him. Why would I do that? He made it very clear where his priorities lay 25 years ago. Oh, Willow, she sighed. Still holding on to that childish resentment. Your father had opportunities that couldn't wait for a family to catch up. Sometimes men make those choices. It's why I always encouraged you to be self-sufficient, to not rely on a man's presence or approval. The irony of her statement, when she'd spent my entire life trying to shape me according to her own expectations, wasn't lost on me. But before I could respond, Marcus approached, his expression apologetic. Sorry to interrupt, but the CEO wants to say a few words, Willow. I nodded, grateful for the rescue even as anxiety churned in my stomach. Richard Palmer, the company's founder and current CEO, soon to be replaced by my estranged father, had always been supportive of my work, but we'd interacted only a handful of times. As we moved toward the front of the room, my mother close. Behind, Marcus leaned in. Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that, I murmured. Richard Palmer stood tall at the front of the room, his silver hair and piercing blue eyes giving him the look of a distinguished statesman rather than a tech executive. At 65, he still maintained the energy and enthusiasm that had built Palmer Technologies from a garage startup to a global leader in network security. I won't keep you long, he began, after the room quieted. But I wanted to personally congratulate Willow Parker on her well-deserved promotion. When Willow joined us 5 years ago, she impressed us with her fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. Since then, she's consistently demonstrated not just technical excellence, but the kind of leadership that can't be taught, the ability to inspire others, to see solutions where others see only problems, and to persist when the path forward isn't clear. He gestured for me to join him, and I moved forward on autopilot, too overwhelmed by the evening's revelations to fully process what was happening. Willow's work on the secure data processing protocol represents the future of Palmer Technologies, a future that will soon be guided by new leadership, as some of you may have heard. But whatever changes come, talent like Willow's will remain the cornerstone of our success. As applause filled the room, I caught my mother's expression, a complex mixture of pride and calculation that made my skin crawl. Whatever game she was playing by showing up tonight and dropping the bombshell about my father, I was determined not to be a pawn in it. Later, as the celebration wound down and colleagues began to depart, my mother cornered me again. I'm having brunch with some friends tomorrow at Elliott's. Why don't you join us? We could continue our conversation. I have plans, I lied smoothly. Rain check? Willow. Her tone sharpened. I think we both know this situation with your father requires discussion. You'll be working directly under him soon. There are considerations. Any considerations are between me and him, I replied, keeping my voice low. Not you. Her perfectly manicured hand closed around my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Don't be naive. Dominic's return to Seattle isn't coincidence. After all these years, don't you think it's time to understand the full picture of what happened to our family? I stared at her, something cold settling in my chest. What are you saying? I'm saying there are things you don't know. Things that might change how you view both your father and your career choices. She released my wrist, smoothing her already immaculate hair. Sunday brunch. Don't be late. With that parting shot, she air-kissed my cheek and glided toward the elevator, leaving me standing amidst the debris of my celebration, balloons beginning to wilt as the night drew to a close. Priya appeared at my side, wordlessly offering a glass of water. Want to talk about it? I shook my head, then reconsidered. Actually, yes, but not here. Drinks at Sullivan's? I'll text Aiden, she agreed, already pulling out her phone. He was asking if you were okay. Your mom is a piece of work, I suggested. I was going to say intimidating as hell, but sure, let's go with that. 20 minutes later, settled in a corner booth at Sullivan's with Priya and Aiden, I finally let myself process the evening's events. The bar's dim lighting and leather, booths offered a comforting anonymity after the spotlight of the promotion party. So let me get this straight, Aiden said, after I'd recounted my mother's revelation. Your absentee father is about to become the CEO of Palmer, and your mother just dropped this bomb on you at your promotion party? That about sums it up, I confirmed, taking a long sip of my whiskey sour. Classic Tiffany Parker move. She's never approved of my career, but she's always excelled at using information as currency. Priya frowned. But why tell you now? If she's so against your tech career, wouldn't she have mentioned this earlier? Tried to get you to leave the company? Before he arrived? The question hit a nerve I hadn't even realized was exposed. That's what I can't figure out. She implied there's something I don't know about why he left. I stared into my drink. 25 years of silence, and suddenly he's going to be working in the same building. Are you going to talk to him? Aiden asked. I don't know. The thought of facing Dominic Richards after all these years made my stomach twist. What would I even say? Hey, remember me, your abandoned daughter? Nice corner office. Priya's expression softened. You don't have to decide tonight, Will. Whatever you choose, we've got your back. Aiden nodded in agreement. And hey, if things get weird, you can always jump ship to Nexus Tech. My buddy Ryan says they're desperate for security architects. I managed a weak smile. Thanks, but I'm not giving up the job I've worked my ass off for just because my family drama decided to invade my professional life. That's our girl, Priya said, raising her glass. To standing your ground. As we clinked glasses, I tried to ignore the pit in my stomach. Tomorrow I'd deal with the implications of my father's impending arrival. Tonight, at least, I still had this. Friends who valued me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. But as I lay in bed hours later, sleep eluding me despite the whiskey and exhaustion, I couldn't shake my mother's words. Things you don't know. Things that might change how you view both your father and your career choices. Whatever game she was playing, I was suddenly uncomfortably certain that I was missing crucial pieces of the board. My apartment had always been my sanctuary. A converted warehouse space in Capitol Hill with exposed brick walls, tall windows that let in Seattle's rare sunlight and enough distance from my past that I could breathe freely. Sunday morning, I woke to rain pattering against those windows, the sky a sheet of steel gray that matched my mood. I'd spent Saturday buried in work, using the complex problems of network security to avoid thinking about my father's imminent arrival or my mother's cryptic statements. But as I stared at my ceiling, tracing the paths of water shadows from the rain-streaked windows, avoidance no longer seemed possible. Brunch with my mother and her friends was the last thing I wanted. Those gatherings inevitably turned into subtle competitions, whose children were most successful, most settled, most aligned with parental expectations. I'd long ago accepted that I would never win in my mother's scorekeeping system. I reached for my phone, tempted to text the standard excuse, Unexpected work emergency. So sorry to miss it. But something stopped me. The questions that had circled my mind since Friday night needed answers, and as uncomfortable as it might be, my mother was currently my only source of information. The shower's hot water couldn't quite wash away my apprehension, but by the time I'd dressed in dark jeans, a crisp blue button-down, and a charcoal blazer, my armor for maternal encounters, I'd formulated a strategy. I would extract what information I could without allowing myself to be manipulated. I would maintain boundaries. I would remember that I was an adult with a successful career, not the child desperately seeking approval. At 11:30, I stepped into Elliot's, immediately spotting my mother at a window table overlooking the bay. She sat with 3 other women, all similarly styled in expensive casual wear, their laughter carrying across the restaurant with practiced modulation, pleasant enough to be heard, not so loud as to draw attention. "Willow, darling, you made it," my mother greeted as I approached, rising for the obligatory air kiss. "You remember Caroline Winters, Susan Hampton, and Victoria Mercer?" I nodded politely, taking the empty seat that faced away from the view. Another of my mother's subtle power plays, positioning herself to enjoy the scenery while leaving me to face the wall. Some battles weren't worth fighting. "We were just discussing Victoria's daughter's engagement," my mother continued smoothly. "Investment banker, Princeton graduate, family home in the Hamptons." She didn't quite wink, but the implication was clear. This was what success looked like in her world. "Congratulations," I offered, reaching for the water glass already waiting at my place setting. "Though I hope he has more to offer than credentials and real estate." Victoria's smile tightened fractionally. "They're very well suited. Emily has always been drawn to ambitious men with proper backgrounds. Unlike some young women who seem determined to forge unconventional paths," my mother added, her tone light, but her meaning unmistakable. I felt a flash of the old familiar hurt, quickly replaced by irritation. I was done being the cautionary tale at her social gatherings. "Unconventional paths can lead to senior systems engineer positions at leading tech companies," I replied evenly. "Speaking of which, I believe you had some insights about Palmer's new leadership you wanted to share, Mom?" The other women exchanged glances, aware of some underlying tension, but not privy to its details. My mother's smile never wavered, though I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around her mimosa glass. "Perhaps we should order first," she deflected, smoothly. "The salmon eggs Benedict here is divine." The next 20 minutes passed in excruciating small talk. Caroline's new interior designer, Susan's recent Mediterranean cruise, Victoria's charity gala preparations. I contributed minimal responses while watching my mother carefully. She was stalling, which wasn't like her. Tiffany Parker typically wielded information like a scalpel, precise and deliberate. When the women excused themselves to the restroom, in a choreographed departure that left my mother and me alone at the table, I seized the opportunity. "You didn't invite me here to discuss Victoria's future son-in-law," I said quietly. "What's going on with Dad's return to Seattle? And why does it matter to you after all these years?" She set down her fork, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Dominic's decision to accept the CEO position at Palmer wasn't made in isolation, Willow. He's been monitoring your career for some time." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implications expanding outward. "What do you mean, monitoring?" "Your father may have been physically absent, but he's kept tabs on you. Did you never wonder how you landed an interview? At Palmer, straight out of graduate school? With no industry experience to speak of?" I stared at her, a cold sensation spreading through my chest. "I got that job on merit. My thesis on network vulnerability was published in 2 major journals. Yes, and who do you think made sure those journals landed on the right desks at Palmer?" She sipped her mimosa, watching my reaction over the rim of her glass. "Dominic has been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. Your scholarship to MIT, that convenient internship opening, even your apartment. The waiting list for that building is 2 years long, yet you got in within a month of applying. The restaurant seemed to recede around me, ambient noise fading as I processed her. Words. My entire career, my proudest achievements, had they all been orchestrated? Not earned, but arranged by a father who couldn't be bothered to show up for parent-teacher conferences or high school graduation? That's not possible, I said. But even as the denial left my lips, I was mentally cataloging coincidences I'd attributed to luck or timing. Why would he do that and never contact me directly? Because I asked him not to, she replied simply. It was part of our agreement when he left. Agreement? I repeated, my voice rising enough that a couple at the next table glanced over. I lowered it with effort. What kind of agreement involves a father abandoning his child? My mother sighed, setting down her glass with deliberate care. The world isn't as black and white as you'd like to believe, Willow. When Dominic received the London offer, we had decisions to make. His career was taking off, while mine had been sidelined when you were born. He wanted us all to move to London. I refused. So he chose his career over his family, I said, the familiar narrative I'd told myself for years. No, she corrected. I chose my life here over following him. I had my own ambitions, my own connections. What was I supposed to do in London? Play corporate wife while my own opportunities withered? Be dependent on his success? She shook her head. That wasn't the life I wanted. I struggled to process this revision of my family history. So you, what? Told him to go without us? I told him we would both be better off pursuing our separate paths. He could focus on his career without family obligations holding him back. And I could rebuild my own life here. The only complication was you. Her gaze softened slightly. We agreed that I would have primary custody, that he would provide financial support but limited contact to avoid confusion for you. And in exchange, he would use his influence to help secure your future when the time came. The food in front of me might as well have been cardboard. You bargained with my relationship with my father, used me as a negotiating chip? I protected you, she countered. From the instability of shuttling between continents, from a father who would have been present only intermittently, and I ensured your future would be secure. By orchestrating my entire career path, anger rose in me, hot and clarifying. Did it ever occur to either of you that I might want to make my own choices? That I didn't need or want puppet strings attached to my accomplishments? Don't be melodramatic, my mother chided. Your achievements are still your own. Dominic merely opened doors. You had to walk through them on your own merit. Why are you telling me this now? After letting me believe for 25 years that he simply walked away, she hesitated, something unusual for my always composed mother. Because Dominic is breaking our agreement by taking the Palmer position, by inserting himself directly into your life without warning. And because... She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. Because he's been pushing to reestablish contact with you for years, and I've been discouraging it. The admission hung between us, damning in its simplicity. All those years I'd believed my father had forgotten me, moved on to his new family without a backward glance. All those birthdays when cards stopped coming, holidays when his absence felt like an accusation. Had he been reaching out all along? What do you mean, discouraging it? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. The return of her friends saved her from answering immediately, but the calculating look in her eyes told me enough. As the women resumed their seats, chattering about someone they'd encountered in the restroom, I sat in stunned silence, my world tilting on its axis. My phone buzzed. With a text from Priya, SOS, Richardson's system crashed. Need you ASAP. I stood abruptly. I have to go. Work emergency. I turned to my mother, not bothering to smooth my expression into something socially acceptable. This conversation isn't over. Brunch at my place next. Sunday, she countered. a statement rather than a question. There's more you need to know before Dominic arrives. I didn't answer, merely nodding curtly to her friends before striding from the restaurant, the weight of revelations pressing against my ribs like physical pressure. Outside, the rain had stopped, but dark clouds still hung low over Elliott Bay, threatening another downpour. As I drove to the office, hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my mother's words echoed in my mind. Your father may have been physically absent, but he's kept tabs on you. The thought that Dominic Richards had been a silent architect of my career path, the one thing I'd believed was truly mine, filled me with a confused mixture of anger, betrayal, and a treacherous flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. The Richardson system crisis turned out to be exactly the immersive distraction I needed. For the next 8 hours, I lost myself in code and diagnostics, the clean logic of troubleshooting far preferable to the messy complications of family revelations. By the time we'd identified and fixed the security protocol breach, night had fallen again, and my earlier conversation with my mother had receded enough that I could examine it with something approaching objectivity. You're quiet, Priya observed, as we gathered our things to leave. The office was nearly empty, most of the emergency team having departed once the immediate crisis was resolved. Still processing the promotion party fallout? I hesitated, then found myself relaying the brunch conversation in halting sentences. Priya listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to indignation on my behalf. That's seriously messed up, she said when I'd finished. They treated your relationship with your father like some business transaction, and now they're both trying to control the narrative. That's my mother's specialty, I agreed. I just can't figure out her angle in telling me this now. She could have kept quiet, let me discover my father's return through official channels. Maybe she wanted to be the one to break the news, Priya suggested. Information is power, right? And from what you've told me about her, she likes having the upper hand. I nodded slowly. There's something she's still not telling me. Something about why my father is suddenly breaking their agreement after all these years. Are you going to talk to him when he arrives? I stared out at the Seattle skyline, lights glimmering against the night sky. I don't know. Part of me wants to confront him, demand explanations, and part of me. I trailed off, the admission difficult even with Priya. Is afraid of what you'll find out? She finished gently. Is afraid? I'll believe whatever he tells me, I corrected. That I'm still that little girl waiting at the window for Daddy to come home. Priya squeezed my shoulder. Whatever you decide, just remember, your work here is valid, Willow. String pulling or not, no one debugs a system like you do. No one could have fixed that Richardson mess tonight but you. Her words provided a small comfort as I drove home through Seattle's light evening traffic. Whatever machinations had brought me to Palmer Technologies, I had proven myself 1,000 times over since walking through those doors. No one, not even Dominic Richards, could take that away from me. But as I unlocked my apartment door, a new, unsettling thought occurred to me. If my mother had been discouraging my father's attempts to contact me, what exactly did that mean? Had there been messages I never received? Calls that never reached me? The possibilities gnawed at me as I moved through my evening routine on autopilot. Just before midnight, driven by an impulse I couldn't quite name, I dug through my closet until I found the old shoebox I'd carried through multiple moves but rarely opened. Inside were the fragments of my relationship with my father, birthday cards that had grown increasingly impersonal over the years before stopping entirely, a few photographs, the worn stuffed elephant he'd brought me from a business trip when I was 6. I spread them across my living room floor, studying them like archaeological evidence of an extinct civilization. The last card was from my 16th birthday, a generic message with a $20 bill and a signature that didn't even include "Love, Dad," just Dominic scrawled in hasty blue ink. After that, nothing. Had my mother intercepted later messages? Or had my father truly given up, despite what she'd claimed today? On an impulse, I pulled out my laptop and did something I'd resisted for years. I searched for Dominic Richards on social media. His LinkedIn profile appeared first. Current COO at Westfield Dynamics, London. Prior executive positions at 3 other tech companies, MBA from Stanford, board member for several industry associations. The professional history of a man I didn't know. There were few personal photos publicly available, but one caught my eye. Dominic at what appeared to be a charity gala, arm around a stylish woman I assumed was his wife, Emma. They stood with a young man in graduation robes, his features a younger echo of my father's. My half-brother, Alexander, 22 according to the caption, graduating from Oxford. The brother I'd never met, the family that had replaced mine. I closed the laptop, a hollow feeling expanding in my chest. Whatever game my parents were playing, I was determined not to be a pawn in it. Tomorrow, I would focus on what I could control, my work, my team, the projects that had earned me my promotion, regardless of who might have first opened the door. But as I gathered the cards and photos, returning them to their shoebox, one slipped from my grasp. It fluttered to the floor, landing face down. I picked it up, my 10th birthday card, and something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the card, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, a small sequence of numbers, written in tiny script. I frowned, examining it more closely. It wasn't a date or any obvious numerical pattern. On a hunch, I checked the other cards. 3 others had similar sequences, each different, each carefully hidden in the design elements of the card. What had my father been trying to tell me? Monday morning arrived with a memo from HR. Palmer Technologies welcomes new leadership. The email confirmed what my mother had already revealed. Dominic Richards would assume the CEO position on the 1st of next month, bringing a wealth of international experience and innovative vision to guide Palmer into its next chapter of growth. Attached was a professional headshot that hit me with unexpected force. My father at 58 looked both familiar and like a stranger. The same strong jawline and dark eyes I remembered, now framed by silver-streaked hair and lines that spoke of years I hadn't witnessed. I stared at the image longer than was professionally advisable, searching for something I couldn't quite name. "They're setting up the executive floor for his arrival next week," Marcus commented, appearing in my office doorway. "Rumor has it he's bringing in some of his own people from London." I minimized the email quickly, irrationally worried that Marcus might somehow connect me to the incoming CEO. "That's pretty standard with leadership changes," I managed. "True, but some of the old guard are nervous. Palmer's always promoted from within. An outsider brings unknown variables." He studied me with the perceptive gaze that made him an excellent manager. "You okay? You seemed off at the Richardson crisis." "Yesterday," I forced a smile. "Just processing a lot. The promotion, new responsibilities, family stuff. Speaking of which, your mother is." He paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic description. "A force of nature," I supplied. "That's the polite version." He laughed. "She certainly knows how to command a room. Must have been interesting growing up with her." Interesting is one word for it. I hesitated, then found myself asking, "Marcus, how did my application land on your desk 5 years ago? Did HR send it through normal channels or—" His expression shifted to something unreadable. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the hiring process now that I'll be building my own team." He seemed to consider his words carefully. "Your resume came to my attention through a board member. Said you were promising talent we shouldn't overlook." The confirmation of my mother's revelation landed like a stone in my stomach. "Did they mention who I was? Any connection to someone at the company?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, even as bitter disappointment flooded me. "Thanks for being honest." "Willow," he said, his voice gentle. "Regardless of how your application reached me, you've more than proven yourself. The board member might have opened the door, But you're the one who's rebuilt this department's entire security architecture. I nodded again, unable to trust my voice. After he left, I sat staring at the minimized email, at the tiny corner of my father's photograph still visible on my screen. I'd spent 5 years believing I'd earned my position solely through merit, that I'd created something entirely my own, separate from my complicated family legacy. Now that narrative was crumbling, and I wasn't sure what would remain when the dust settled. The rest of the week passed in a blur of project handoffs, team meetings, and preparations for my new role. I buried myself in work, using the complex problems of network security as a shield against thoughts of my father's imminent arrival. I declined my mother's calls twice, not ready for another conversation that might further destabilize my sense of self. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself that I could maintain professional distance when Dominic Richards arrived, that I could treat him as simply the new CEO, not the father who had shaped my life through both his absence and his apparent behind-the-scenes machinations. Then came the email from his executive assistant. Mr. Richards would like to schedule a brief meeting with you on his first day. Please advise your availability. Not a company-wide meeting, not a department review, a personal meeting, singling me out among hundreds of employees. I stared at the message, fingers hovering over my keyboard. I could decline, cite scheduling conflicts, projects requiring immediate attention. I could avoid this confrontation entirely, but the memory of those hidden numbers in my birthday cards nagged at me. What if there was more to the story than my mother had revealed? What if I'd spent 25 years blaming my father for abandonment that was more complicated than I'd understood as a child? Available anytime, I replied, then immediately regretted the eagerness implied by my response. But before I could send a more measured follow-up, the assistant confirmed, Mr. Richards will see you at 10 a.m. on Monday, April 4th. He has blocked 30 minutes. 30 minutes to unpack 25 years of absence. It seemed both impossibly brief and unbearably long. I left work early that Friday, unable to focus on code or schematics with Monday's meeting looming. The spring afternoon was unusually clear for Seattle, sunlight glinting off the waters of Puget Sound as I drove aimlessly, eventually finding myself heading north toward Whidbey Island, a place my father had taken me camping once in the before time. I hadn't planned to visit my mother, but as I passed the exit that would lead to her Bellevue mansion, an impulse seized me. If I was going to face my father on Monday, I needed more information, not filtered through my mother's agenda, but direct and unvarnished. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the circular driveway of the house where I'd spent my teenage years. The sprawling contemporary structure with its wall of windows facing Lake Washington had always felt more like a showcase than a home, designed to impress rather than comfort. My mother had purchased it with her divorce settlement, a deliberate statement about her ability to thrive independently. She answered the door herself, surprise briefly crossing her features before her social mask slipped back into place. Willow, what an unexpected pleasure. We need to talk, I said without preamble. And this time, I need the truth, not whatever edited version suits your narrative. She sighed, but stepped aside to let me enter. I suppose this is about Dominic's meeting request? His assistant called to confirm my address. Apparently, he'd like to send over some paperwork. Her tone suggested this was some sort of victory for her. I followed her through the marble-floored foyer into the living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the lake view. What paperwork? Financial documents, I imagine. She moved to the bar cart, lifting a crystal decanter. Scotch? You look like you could use it. It's 4 p.m. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, she replied with a tight smile, pouring herself 2 fingers of amber liquid. And this conversation will likely warrant it. I remained standing as she settled onto the white leather sofa, crossing her legs elegantly. You said you discouraged Dad from contacting me. What exactly did that involve? She sipped her scotch, regarding me over the rim of her glass. what any mother would do to protect her child from inconsistency and disappointment. Dominic's interest in your life was sporadic at best. 1 month he'd be full of promises about visits and future plans. The next, he'd be radio silent. So you, what? Intercepted his messages, returned his calls, sent back his letters? I filtered, she corrected. When he went through phases of renewed interest, I reminded him of our agreement. When he sent inappropriate gifts or suggestions, I redirected them. Inappropriate how? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. Computer equipment when you should have been focusing on college applications. Invitations to visit London when you had ballet recitals and school commitments. A car for your 16th birthday that was far too powerful for a new driver. She waved a dismissive hand. Dominic always did favor grand gestures over practical consideration. The revelation that there had been gifts I'd never received, invitations I'd never known about, landed like physical blows. You had no right, I said, my voice shaking. Those were decisions I should have been allowed to make for myself. You were a child, she countered. Children need stability, not a father who breezes in and out of their lives when it's convenient. Besides, it was all part of our arrangement. Financial support and future career assistance in exchange for a clean break. An arrangement you made without my consent or knowledge, I pointed out. An arrangement that treated me like an asset to be divided in your divorce. Her expression hardened. You're oversimplifying a complex situation. We both wanted what was best for you. What was best for me? I repeated incredulously. Or what was best for you? Did it ever occur to you that having my father in my life, even imperfectly, might have been better than growing up believing I wasn't worth staying for? She set down her glass with deliberate care. Dominic made his choice, Willow. London, his career, eventually his new family. I simply managed the fallout in a way that would cause you the least pain. By lying to me, by manipulating my entire career path, by ensuring you had opportunities. She corrected sharply. Do you think Palmer Technologies routinely hires fresh graduates with no industry experience? Do you think MIT scholarships fall from the sky? Your father may have been an absent parent, but he honored his financial obligations to both of us. The implication in her last words caught my attention. What do you mean, both of us? She hesitated, then sighed, reaching for her scotch. Again. The divorce settlement was substantial, with certain conditions attached. Such as? Ensuring you didn't seek him out, she admitted, not quite meeting my eyes. Maintaining the narrative we'd established about his departure. Cold realization washed over me. You were paid to keep me away from him. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Mom? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you traded my relationship with my father for financial security and a lakefront mansion. She stood abruptly, moving to the window. You have no idea what it was. Like Willow, 32 years old with a 7-year-old daughter, abandoned by a husband who'd promised to build a life with me, but chose his ambitions instead. What was I supposed to do? Follow him to London like a desperate ex-wife? Subject you to custody? Battles across continents? Or accept the settlement that would secure both our futures and move forward with dignity? There's nothing dignified about lying to your child for 25 years, I said quietly. She turned, and for a brief moment, I glimpsed something raw in her expression before her composure reasserted itself. Perhaps not, but it was the best solution to an impossible situation. And now, why is Dad breaking your agreement now? Why take the Palmer position when he must know I work there? She moved back to the sofa, sitting with precise control. Because the conditions of our agreement have an expiration date, 30 years to be exact. The final payment comes due next month, after which Dominic is free to pursue whatever relationship with you he chooses. The clinical language struck me like a physical blow. 30 years. A contract on my relationship with my father, set. to expire just as he conveniently stepped into a position that would place him in my professional orbit. "So this is all about money," I said flatly. "The settlement runs out, so he's making his move." "It's more complicated than that," my mother replied, a note of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "Dominic has been persistent in recent years, asking for updates about your life, sending messages I was contractually obligated to intercept. The Palmer position gives him proximity without technically violating our agreement in its final months." "What kind of messages?" I asked, the question catching in my throat. She hesitated, then rose and crossed to an ornate secretary desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a small wooden box. "See for yourself." The box contained dozens of envelopes, each addressed to me in a handwriting I barely recognized. Birthday cards I'd never received, Christmas greetings that had never reached me, postcards from London, Tokyo, Sydney, places my father had traveled for business, apparently thinking of the daughter he'd left behind. With trembling fingers, I opened the most recent envelope, dated just 3 months ago. "Willow," it read. "Another birthday approaches, and another year passes without contact. I respect the boundaries that exist, though I did not choose them. Know that I have watched your career with immense pride, even from afar. The woman you've become, brilliant, determined, carving your own path, is everything I could have hoped for. In 10 weeks, certain constraints will lift. Perhaps then, if you're willing, we might finally speak directly. Until then, as always, I remain your father, Dominic." I looked up at my mother, vision blurring with unshed tears. "You had no right to keep these from me." "I had every legal right," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "The agreement was binding." "An agreement I never consented to," I reminded her, clutching the letter. "An agreement that ends in 10 weeks, or less, since this is dated 3 months ago." "Dominic moves fast when he wants something," she said, a touch of bitterness coloring her tone. "He always has. The Palmer position, moving to Seattle, it's all calculated to insert himself into your life the moment the agreement expires." I stared at the box of intercepted communications, tangible evidence of a relationship I'd been denied the opportunity to define for myself. "I'm meeting with him on Monday." A flash of something, alarm, concern, crossed my mother's features. "Willow, think carefully. Dominic is a skillful manipulator. This grand gesture, taking the CEO position at your company, is designed to appeal to your shared professional interests, to create a connection where one hasn't existed for 25 years. "Maybe," I acknowledged, gathering the letters and returning them to the box. "Or maybe he's trying to make amends in the only way available to him. Either way, I deserve to hear his side without your filtering. And what about your career?" she pressed. "How will it look when people discover you're the new CEO's daughter? When they question every promotion, every project assignment?" The question struck a nerve she knew well, my lifelong determination to succeed on my own merits. "I'll handle it," I said, more confidently than I felt. "My work speaks for itself." "Does it?" she challenged. "Or does it speak for the opportunities Dominic arranged, the doors he opened, the path he smoothed?" I stood, tucking the box of letters under my arm. "I'm taking these." "They won't give you the answers you're looking for," she warned. "They'll only show you the version of himself he wanted to present, the caring father making noble gestures from a safe distance." "As opposed to the version you've presented for 25 years, I countered. "The heartless careerist who abandoned his family without a backward glance?" We stared at each other across the elegant living room, 2 women locked in a battle that had begun before I was old enough to understand its parameters. For the first time, I saw my mother not as the infallible force who had shaped my childhood, but as a woman who had made difficult choices with the tools available to her. Choices that had protected her own interests as much as mine. "I did what I thought was best," she said finally, a rare note of uncertainty in her voice. "I believe you. I replied, surprising myself with the realization that I did. But I need to make my own choices now. As I drove back to Seattle, the box of letters on the passenger seat beside me, I felt something shift within me, a rebalancing of the narrative I'd built my identity around. I had spent my adult life believing I had been abandoned, disregarded, forgotten. The truth, it seemed, was more complicated. Monday's meeting with my father loomed, a conversation 25 years in the making with no script to follow. Whatever his reasons for seeking me out now, whatever agenda he might have, I would face him not as the abandoned child, but as the woman I had become. A woman who had, perhaps, been shaped by his influence more than I had ever realized, but who had ultimately forged her own path through talent and determination. The letters beside me represented a version of my father I had never been allowed to know. Monday would reveal whether that version bore any resemblance to the real Dominic Richards, and whether there was any possibility of building a relationship from the ashes of the one I thought was lost forever. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, an unusual absence of Seattle's perpetual cloud cover that seemed to mock my internal turmoil. I had spent the weekend poring over my father's letters, constructing a chronological narrative of his attempts to maintain some connection to my life. The early letters were awkward, formal, a man writing to a child he barely knew. Over time, they evolved into something more personal, referencing my academic achievements and later my professional milestones with specific details that confirmed my mother's claim. He had indeed been monitoring my career from afar. I dressed with deliberate care, selecting a charcoal suit that projected professional competence without trying too hard. Armor for a meeting that would blur the boundaries between my personal and professional lives. In the elevator ascending to the executive floor, I rehearsed opening lines, discarding each as too casual or too formal, too accusatory or too forgiving. The executive reception area had been redesigned in anticipation of the new leadership. Sleek, modern furniture replacing Palmer's traditional mahogany, abstract art adorning walls that had previously displayed company achievements. Even the boy receptionist was new, a poised young woman who smiled without recognition when I gave my name. Ms. Parker for Mr. Richards, she confirmed, consulting her screen. He's running a few minutes behind schedule. May I offer you coffee while you wait? I declined, settling into one of the minimalist chairs with more outward calm than I felt. Through glass walls, I could see people moving about the executive offices, familiar faces from the board, unfamiliar ones that must be part of my father's imported team. A flurry of activity surrounded one particular office at the end of the corridor, the CEO's domain, now Dominic Richards' territory. At precisely 10:07, the receptionist's phone buzzed. Mr. Richards will see you now, she announced, rising to escort me down the hallway. Each step felt weighted, time stretching and compressing simultaneously. I focused on my breathing, on maintaining the professional demeanor that had become second nature over 5 years at Palmer. Whatever happened in this meeting, I was still Senior Systems Engineer Willow Parker. That identity, at least, was solid ground beneath my feet. The receptionist knocked on the partially open door, announcing my arrival before disappearing back down the hallway. I stepped into the office, and for the first time in 25 years, stood face to face with my father. Dominic Richards was taller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply been smaller when last we met. His dark hair had silvered at the temples and lines had etched themselves around his eyes and mouth, but the fundamental architecture of his face remained unchanged. The same strong jawline I saw in my own mirror, the same dark eyes that could convey authority without words. He stared at me for a long moment, something raw and unfiltered crossing his features before his professional mask reasserted itself. Willow, he said, my name catching slightly in his throat. Thank you for coming. The formality of the statement nearly broke me, as if I were any employee responding to a CEO's summons, not a daughter seeing her father after a quarter-century of absence. I managed a nod, not yet trusting my voice. He gestured to a seating area by the window, 2 chairs arranged to take advantage of the view, a small table between them. Not the power dynamic of his desk, but not the intimacy of a father-daughter reunion either. A careful middle ground. I imagined this meeting many times, he began once we were seated, his British accent more pronounced than I remembered. Evidence of decades spent in London. Though I admit, I never quite envisioned it taking place in my office. You imagined meeting me? I asked, the question emerging more sharply than intended. His expression shifted, something like regret crossing his features. Many times, particularly as you grew older, as the constraints became more difficult to justify. Constraints, I repeated. You mean the agreement with my mother? He studied me carefully. She told you about that. Some version of it, I confirmed, though I suspect not the complete truth. Few situations contain a complete truth, Willow. Only perspectives, each limited by its vantage point. He leaned forward slightly. May I ask what Tiffany shared with you? I recounted my mother's explanation, the agreement following their divorce, the conditions regarding contact, the financial arrangements that had shaped both their lives and mine. As I spoke, I watched his expression, searching for confirmation or denial of her narrative. That's reasonably accurate, he acknowledged when I'd finished, though it omits certain key elements. Such as? He sighed, glancing out at the Seattle skyline before returning his gaze to me. The agreement wasn't my preferred solution. I wanted joint custody, regular visitation, a continued presence in your life despite the geographical separation. Your mother was adamantly opposed. She said you chose your career over your family, I challenged, that London was more important than maintaining connections here. My career was in ascendance, he acknowledged. The London position represented an opportunity I'd worked toward for years, but I never envisioned it meaning the end of my role as your father. Then why agree to her terms? Why accept such a complete separation? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Because Tiffany made it clear that fighting her would result in a prolonged legal battle that would drain resources better used for your future. And because she convinced me that a clean break would be less damaging to you than years of international custody disputes. The explanation aligned with my mother's controlling tendencies, her determination to manage situations according to her vision of what was appropriate, yet doubt lingered. Why maintain the arrangement for so long? I've been an adult for 14 years. The agreement couldn't have prevented contact once I turned 18. Legally, no, he conceded. But by then, patterns had been established. You had a life constructed around my absence, one in which I was cast as the villain who had abandoned you. Tiffany made it clear that any attempt to contact you directly would be viewed as a disruption, potentially causing you more harm than good. So you continued to respect her boundaries, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. Even as an adult, I was still being shielded from making my own decisions about our relationship. He nodded, relief crossing his features at my comprehension. I tried to find middle paths, the career assistance, the occasional messages through appropriate channels, ways to remain connected without violating the terms that governed our separation. The numbers in the birthday cards, I said, remembering the tiny sequences I'd discovered. What were those? A smile touched his lips for the first time, a familiar expression that sent an unexpected pang through my chest. Coordinates, places. I thought you might enjoy visiting someday. A lighthouse in Nova Scotia, a secluded beach in Thailand, the view from Sacré-Cœur in Paris at sunset. The revelation struck me with unexpected force. These weren't just random markings, but invitations, subtle connections to a father I'd believed had forgotten me. I never knew. I hoped someday you might decipher them, he admitted. A foolish fancy, perhaps. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decades of miscommunication and missed opportunities hanging between us. Outside the window, Seattle continued its Monday morning rhythm, unaware of the personal earthquake reshaping my understanding of my own history. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Why take this position, knowing I worked here?" His expression grew more serious. "Two reasons. First, the agreement with your mother expires next month. I've honored its terms for 30 years, but I've no intention of continuing the separation beyond that obligation. And the second reason? The Richardson acquisition." He watched my reaction carefully. "Palmer needs to integrate their security protocols with our existing systems, a complex undertaking that could determine the company's future position in the market. Your work on secure data processing makes you uniquely qualified to lead that integration." I stared at him, professional pride warring with personal suspicion. "You took this job to work with me, or to use my expertise?" "Both," he admitted without apology. "You're brilliant, Willow. Your innovations in network security are precisely what Palmer needs at this juncture. And yes, the professional collaboration offers a pathway to rebuild some form of relationship if you're willing." The calculated nature of his approach, using our shared professional interests as a bridge across 25 years of absence, struck me as both manipulative and oddly touching. This was a man accustomed to strategic thinking, to identifying leverage points and opportunities. He was applying those same skills to our fractured relationship. "What if I don't want a relationship?" I challenged. "What if your career strategies and careful planning mean nothing against 25 years of believing you simply didn't care enough to stay?" Pain flashed across his features, raw and unguarded. "Then I will respect your decision, though it would greatly disappoint me. But I hope you'll consider the possibility that the narrative you've lived with isn't the complete picture. That perhaps both your mother and I made decisions that seemed right at the time, but resulted in unintended harm." The humility in his response disarmed me. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps a counterattack against my mother's version of events. Instead, he offered something more complex, an acknowledgement of imperfection, of human fallibility in the face of difficult choices. "The Richardson integration," I said, deliberately shifting to more comfortable professional territory. "What exactly are you proposing?" He accepted the redirection with a slight nod. "A special project team reporting directly to me rather than through traditional management layers. You would lead the technical aspects while collaborating with Richardson's existing security personnel to ensure seamless integration of their protocols with Palmer's architecture." "Bypassing Marcus and the department structure," I noted. "That's unusual." "The project requires unusual handling," he countered, "and direct communication between key personnel without bureaucratic filters." The irony wasn't lost on me, a father proposing unfiltered communication after decades of carefully managed messaging. "People will talk," I pointed out, "if the new CEO singles me out for a high-profile project immediately after taking the position." "Let them," he replied simply. "Your qualifications speak for themselves, though eventually our family connection will become known." The thought sent a flutter of anxiety through me. I've worked hard to establish my reputation here, to prove myself on my own merits. "And you have," he assured me. "Whatever strings I may have pulled to open initial doors, your achievements since then have been entirely your own. I couldn't have maintained your position here or earned you your promotions. Only your own excellence could accomplish that." His certainty provided a small measure of reassurance, though doubts still lingered. "I need time," I said finally, "to process all of this, to decide if I'm willing to work directly with you, let alone attempt any kind of personal relationship." "Of course." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a business card, writing a number on the back before handing it to me. "My personal mobile, not filtered through assistants or gatekeepers, available to you whenever you're ready to continue this conversation, professionally or otherwise." I accepted the card, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. A simple human contact that shouldn't have felt significant but somehow did, the first direct connection between father and daughter in 25 years. The project proposal will be in your inbox by end of day, he continued, professional tone returning. Review it at your convenience. If you choose not to participate, I'll understand and make alternative arrangements. It was a graceful exit offer, allowing me space to retreat without burning professional bridges. I stood, tucking the card into my jacket pocket. Thank you for your transparency, I said formally, unsure how else to end this surreal meeting. Willow. He rose as well, hesitating before adding, whatever you decide about the project, about our potential relationship, I want you to know I've always been proud of you. Even from a distance, watching your accomplishments has been one of my life's greatest joys. The simple statement hit me with unexpected force, the explicit parental approval I'd unconsciously sought through years of academic and professional achievements. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and turned toward the door. The lighthouse in Maine, he said, as I reached for the handle. The coordinates in your 12th birthday card. I always thought you'd like it there. Something about the solitude, the steadfastness, the way it guides vessels safely home despite storms and darkness. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it landed with precision nonetheless. I glanced back at him. This stranger who was also my father. This CEO who was also the man whose DNA had given me my analytical mind and stubborn determination. I've never been to Maine, I said. Perhaps someday, he replied, offering neither pressure nor expectation, simply possibility. As I left the executive floor and returned to the familiar territory of my department, I felt strangely unmoored, as if the foundations I'd built my adult life upon had shifted, revealing new perspectives. I couldn't yet fully comprehend. The narrative I'd constructed about my father's abandonment, my mother's protection, my own independent success, all required re-examination in light of these revelations. The project proposal arrived in my inbox at 4:47 p.m., comprehensive, challenging, and meticulously tailored to my expertise. A professional opportunity that would advance my career regardless of the complicated personal dynamics behind it. My father was offering me what he understood best, a path forward through shared work, through the application of our similar minds, to complex problems requiring elegant solutions. I closed my office door and called Priya, needing an outside perspective untainted by decades of family history. If your complicated family drama wasn't a factor, she said after I'd outlined the situation, would this project be a good career move? Objectively, yes, I admitted. It's high profile, utilizes my strongest skills, and would position me for future advancement. Then maybe that's your answer for now, she suggested. Accept the professional opportunity while taking time to decide about the personal relationship. Set boundaries, establish professional rapport, see if trust can be rebuilt from there. Her practical approach appealed to the problem solver in me. This wasn't an all-or-nothing proposition. I could engage with my father professionally while maintaining emotional distance, evaluating his trustworthiness through actions rather than words. I drafted my response to the proposal that evening. I accept the project leadership role with the understanding that our working relationship will remain strictly professional while I consider the personal aspects of our connection. My acceptance does not constitute forgiveness or guarantee reconciliation, merely a willingness to collaborate on work that benefits Palmer Technologies. His reply came within minutes. Terms accepted, looking forward to our collaboration. No emotional appeal, no pressure for more than I was offering, just a straightforward acknowledgement of my boundaries. It was, I realized, a more respectful response than I'd ever received from my mother when establishing limits in our relationship. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. The lighthouse stands ready whenever you decide to visit. No pressure, no expectations, only possibility. Dr. I saved the number under Dominic Richards, not yet able to label it Dad. But for the first time in 25 years, I allowed myself to consider that such a designation might someday feel appropriate again. The Richardson integration project launched the following week, consuming my professional energy with welcome intensity. Working directly with my father, with Dominic, as I carefully referred to him in all professional contexts, proved both challenging and unexpectedly rewarding. His analytical approach mirrored my own, his ability to identify potential security, vulnerabilities nearly matching my specialized expertise despite his broader focus as CEO. We maintained strict professional boundaries during work hours. Our interactions focused entirely on the project's technical and organizational challenges. If colleagues noticed the new CEO's particular interest in my department or questioned my sudden promotion to project lead, they kept such observations to themselves, at least within my hearing. My mother, predictably, was less circumspect about her opinions. Her calls and texts increased in frequency as news of the special project team spread through industry channels, her messages alternating between thinly veiled warnings about Dominic's motivations and casual inquiries about my professional relationship with the new CEO. I maintained polite distance, unwilling to engage in her attempts to influence my developing connection with my father. The box of intercepted letters remained on my coffee table at home, a tangible reminder of what had been kept from me, of the choices that had been made without my input or consent. 3 weeks into the project, as we approached a critical integration milestone, Dominic suggested a working dinner to review our progress away from office interruptions. I hesitated only briefly before accepting, recognizing it as a tentative step toward the personal relationship we had both carefully avoided discussing since our initial meeting. We met at a small Italian restaurant in Pioneer Square, upscale enough for privacy, but lacking the formality that might have made the evening feel like a structured corporate dinner. Seated at a corner table with project documents spread between our wine glasses, we reviewed technical specifications and implementation timelines with practiced efficiency. It was only after the meal, as espresso replaced work folders, that the conversation shifted toward personal territory. "Alexander asks about you," Dominic said, his tone casual, though the subject was anything but. "My son, your half-brother. He's always known about you." I took a measured sip of espresso, buying time to process this revelation. "What have you told him?" "The truth, as much as possible. That I have a daughter from my first marriage. That circumstances prevented the relationship I would have wanted with you. That you're brilliant and accomplished, someone he would admire if given the chance to know you." The thought of this stranger, this brother who shared my blood but none of my history, curious about me, stirred complicated emotions. "Does he resent my sudden appearance in your life?" Dominic smiled slightly. "Quite the opposite. He's rather annoyed it took me so long to finally do something about it, as he puts it. Alexander has strong opinions about family responsibilities." "He's 22, I noted, remembering the graduation photo I'd seen online. "Hardly in a position to judge complex adult situations." "Perhaps not," Dominic acknowledged. "But youth sometimes brings clarity where age has constructed justifications. He sees the situation in simpler terms than I allowed myself to." I traced the rim of my espresso cup, considering his words. "And your wife? How does she feel about your long-lost daughter suddenly working directly with you?" "Emma has always known about you," he replied. "She encouraged my attempts to maintain some connection, limited though they were, and she supported this move to Seattle, despite the disruption to her own career." "What does she do?" I realized how little I knew about this family that was technically mine. These people connected to me by law and blood, but strangers in every meaningful sense. "She's a curator at the British Museum, or was until our relocation. She's currently consulting for the Seattle Art Museum on their upcoming exhibition of British modernists." Pride colored his tone as he added, "Emma has quite the reputation in art history circles." "And she gave that up to follow you here," I observed, thinking of my mother's refusal to make a similar choice decades earlier. Dominic seemed to follow my train of thought. "Different women, different circumstances," he said gently. Emma and I built our life together from the beginning, making decisions as partners. Your mother and I..." He hesitated. "We were younger, more concerned with individual goals than shared ones. And when those goals diverged, we lacked the tools to find common ground." The assessment sounded reasonable, mature even, yet it stood in stark contrast to the narrative I'd grown up with, where my father was the villain who had chosen career over family without a backward glance. "Mom says you gave her an ultimatum," I said, testing his response. "London or divorce." He sighed, setting down his cup. "That's her interpretation. I would say I presented a choice. Relocate as a family or separate with fair provisions for both of you. She chose the latter." "And the agreement? The 30-year separation? Was that your idea or hers?" "The financial arrangement was my suggestion," he admitted. "A structure that would provide security and opportunities for you while respecting Tiffany's desire for independence. The restrictions on contact were her addition, conditions she insisted upon for what she termed clean closure." "Which you accepted," I pointed out. "Yes," he acknowledged, meeting my gaze directly. "A decision I've questioned countless times over the years. But at the time, faced with your mother's determination and concerns about a protracted international custody battle, it seemed the option least likely to cause you immediate harm." His candor was disarming. No attempts to rewrite history or cast himself as blameless, simply an explanation of choices made with limited information and imperfect judgment. It was more honesty than my mother had typically offered about her own decisions regarding my upbringing. "The career assistance," I said, circling back to a point that still troubled me. "Opening doors at Palmer, arranging opportunities. Why that approach rather than direct support?" A flash of something like regret crossed his features. "It was the available channel that didn't violate our agreement. I couldn't be present in your life as a father, but I could ensure you had opportunities to utilize your talents. And perhaps selfishly, it allowed me to feel I was contributing to your future in some meaningful way." Even though I didn't know the source, I noted. "Would you have accepted direct help from the father you believed had abandoned you?" he asked quietly. The question landed with uncomfortable precision. Of course I wouldn't have. My pride and hurt would have rejected any such overture. The indirect assistance had bypassed those barriers, allowing him to support my career without triggering the abandonment wounds that would have caused me to refuse direct help. Our conversation was interrupted by a text message alert. The project team lead from Richardson reporting an unexpected compatibility issue with the security protocols we were scheduled to implement the following day. The personal discussion was set aside as we shifted back to professional problem-solving mode, reviewing code and system architecture to identify the source of the conflict. By the time we resolved the technical issue, the restaurant was preparing to close, and the moment for deeper personal revelations had passed. As we gathered our materials, Dominic hesitated before asking, "Would you be interested in meeting Emma and Alexander? They'll be arriving in Seattle next week to help with the relocation." The invitation hung between us, a significant escalation from our carefully managed professional relationship, a step toward the family connection he clearly hoped to establish. My immediate instinct was to deflect, to maintain the emotional distance that had protected me for so long. But the past month of working with my father had begun to erode that protective barrier. His consistent respect for my boundaries, his willingness to address difficult questions without defensiveness, his evident respect for both my personal and professional autonomy, all had begun to construct a foundation of tentative trust. "Dinner, perhaps," I offered. "Something casual, not too loaded with expectations." The smile that crossed his face, genuine pleasure untainted by calculation, reminded me vividly of photographs from my early childhood, before the divorce, when family still meant both parents present. "They'll be delighted," he said simply. "As am I." The dinner with Emma and Alexander was scheduled for Friday evening at my father's temporary apartment in downtown Seattle. A neutral location, as he put it, rather than a restaurant where Professional colleagues might observe the family gathering. As the day approached, my anxiety mounted, manifesting in uncharacteristic distraction during project meetings and late-night coding sessions that owed more to avoidance than necessity. Priya noticed, of course. "You're overthinking this," she observed as we shared lunch in my office on Thursday. "They're just people, Will. People who are probably as nervous about meeting you as you are about meeting them. They've had 25 years to form opinions about me through my father's lens," I pointed out. "While I've had 3 weeks to adjust to their existence." "Fair point," she conceded. "But from what you've told me about your dad, he seems to have been pretty honest about the situation. It's not like they're coming in with some distorted villain narrative about you." The observation struck home. My father had apparently been truthful with his second family about my existence, while my mother had carefully curated what information I received about him. The contrast wasn't flattering to Tiffany Parker's approach to parenting. "I'm just not sure what they expect from me," I admitted. "Instant family bonding? Polite distance? Something in between? Maybe they're following your father's lead." "No. Expectations. Just possibility." She smiled, echoing Dominic's words from our first meeting. "Take it as a fact-finding mission. Learn who they are, let them learn who you are, and see if there's common ground worth building on." Her practical approach helped settle my nerves, at least until I stood outside my father's apartment door Friday evening, bottle of wine in hand, wondering if I should have worn something other than dark jeans and a silk blouse. Before I could reconsider my wardrobe choice, the door opened to reveal a young man whose features immediately registered as familiar. My father's jawline, my father's eyes, but set in a face unlined by decades of experience. "Willow," he said, grinning widely. "I was starting to think you might have bailed. I'm Alex." "Not Alexander," I noted. "Alex." Less formal than my father typically was, closer to my own preference for the shortened Will among friends. "Sorry," I managed, offering the wine. "I was second-guessing my outfit choices." "You look great," he assured me, accepting the bottle and stepping aside to let me enter. Very Seattle tech professional chic, much cooler than Dad's boring suits. His easy manner was unexpected. No awkwardness or forced politeness, just straightforward friendliness that suggested he'd decided in advance to like me. I found myself relaxing slightly as I followed him into the apartment's open-plan living area, where my father and a slender woman with ash-blonde hair were arranging serving dishes on a dining table. "She didn't run away," Alex announced, brandishing the wine bottle. "And she brought the good stuff." Dominic looked up, a mixture of relief and pleasure crossing his features. "Willow, I'm glad you could make it." He crossed to my side, offering not a handshake, but a brief, almost hesitant half-embrace, the physical contact we'd both carefully avoided in our professional interactions. "This is Emma," he continued, gesturing to the blonde woman who approached with a warm smile. Emma Richards was not what I'd expected. In my imagination, my father's second wife had been a sleek corporate type, younger, ambitious, the antithesis of my mother's socialite polish. Instead, Emma appeared to be roughly my father's age, her style artistic rather than fashionable, her handshake firm and unpretentious. "I've looked forward to meeting you for quite some time," she said, her British accent softer than my father's. "Dominic speaks of you often, and always with immense pride." The sincerity in her tone was disarming. No hint of the awkwardness I'd anticipated from a stepmother meeting her husband's adult daughter from a previous marriage. She treated my presence as natural, expected, rather than the complicated collision of past and present it represented. "I've been adjusting to the idea of all of you a bit more recently," I admitted, honesty feeling safer than polite deflection. Emma laughed, a genuine sound without artifice. "I can imagine. Dominic warned us you might find this all a bit overwhelming. We're trying not to come on too strong, though I suspect Alex may have already failed in that department." "Hey," my half-brother protested good-naturedly. "I was chill, super chill. Willow, tell her how chill I was." The easy banter between them spoke of a family dynamic built on affection and security, the kind of relationship I'd observed in friends' families but rarely experienced in my own upbringing with my mother. It stirred a complicated mixture of envy and curiosity, a glimpse of what might have been had circumstances been different. Dinner proved surprisingly comfortable, the conversation flowing more easily than I'd anticipated. Alex, it turned out, was pursuing a graduate degree in environmental engineering. The family technical gene didn't skip a generation, my father noted with evident pride, while balancing semi-professional mountain biking competitions. Emma spoke enthusiastically about her curatorial work and the challenges of translating British modernism for American audiences. Throughout the meal, I observed the interactions between the three of them, the shorthand of inside jokes, the comfortable disagreements, the rhythm of a family accustomed to sharing space and conversation. My father was different with them than in our professional interactions, more relaxed, less measured in his responses, occasionally even self-deprecating in a way I'd never witnessed at Palmer. "Dominic tells us you're a brilliant systems architect," Emma said as we moved to the living room with coffee and dessert. "Though I confess most of the technical details go over my head." "Dad tries to explain her work to us," Alex added, dropping onto the sofa beside me. "But he gets so excited about security protocols that we usually lose the thread about 10 minutes in." I glanced at my father, surprised by this characterization. "He gets excited about network security?" Emma laughed. "Absolutely giddy. It's quite endearing, actually, watching him try to simplify complex technical concepts for us mere mortals." "The Richardson integration has been particularly engaging," Dominic acknowledged, a hint of self-consciousness in his tone. "Willow's approach to the protocol merger is honestly revolutionary. I've learned as much from her as she has from me, if not more." The genuine professional respect in his voice, offered not to me directly, but to his family in casual conversation, landed differently than similar praise in our work setting. This wasn't strategic flattery or management encouragement. It was simple pride in his daughter's abilities, shared with people who mattered to him. "So are we allowed to ask about your life beyond work?" Alex inquired, retrieving a second serving of tiramisu. "Dad's been super careful about respecting your boundaries, but I'm dying to know more about my sister. Do you mountain bike? Please say yes. I need an ally in my campaign to get Dad back on a bike." The casual designation, "my sister," caught me off guard. Alex had apparently decided our biological connection was sufficient basis for claiming familial relationship, bypassing the careful distance I'd maintained with our father. "I'm more of a kayaker," I admitted. "Seattle waterways are kind of perfect for it." "Even better," he enthused. "I've been wanting to try that. Maybe you could show me some good spots before I head back to London next month." The invitation was offered easily, without pressure or expectation, yet another possibility extended without demand. It echoed my father's approach, suggesting a family philosophy rather than individual tactic. "Maybe," I said, surprising myself, with the genuine consideration behind the word. The weather should be decent through October. The evening continued in similar vein, gentle inquiries about my life and interests, offers of connection without insistence, glimpses into their family dynamic that seemed designed to include rather than exclude me. By the time I prepared to leave, the anxiety that had preceded the dinner had largely dissolved, replaced by a cautious curiosity about these people who were, in some technical sense, my family. At the door, Emma embraced me briefly, a warm gesture that somehow didn't feel presumptuous. "I hope we'll see more of you before we return to London to finish packing up the house," she said. "But no pressure. We understand this is all rather sudden from your perspective." Alex's goodbye was equally affectionate, but less restrained. A full hug and an extracted promise to text him about potential kayaking excursions. "Sisters are supposed to teach younger brothers cool stuff," he insisted. "It's like a universal law." My father walked me to my car, the September evening cool but clear, stars visible despite the city lights. We stood in silence for a moment, the comfortable conversation of the dinner giving way to the more complicated reality of our still evolving relationship. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said finally. "I know it wasn't easy." "They're nice," I offered, the simple assessment inadequate to the complex emotions the evening had stirred. "Different than I expected." "They've been hoping to meet you for years," he admitted. "Especially Alex. He grew up knowing he had a sister, even if circumstances kept you apart." The thought of this young man growing up with awareness of me, perhaps forming some idealized image of a big sister he'd never met, added another layer to the already complicated situation. "I'm not sure I know how to be a sister," I said honestly. "I've never had siblings." "There's no manual for any of this," my father acknowledged, a hint of wry humor in his tone. "We're all improvising, trying to find our way through uncharted territory." The metaphor reminded me of our shared professional approach, navigating complex systems with careful analysis and adaptive strategy. Perhaps this personal relationship could be approached with similar methodology. Identify the parameters, test potential pathways, adjust based on results. "The kayaking might be a place to start," I suggested. "Low pressure, activity-focused, get to know each other without too much expectation." Relief crossed his features. "Alex would love that. He's been researching Seattle outdoor activities since we told him about the relocation." We fell silent again, standing beside my car in the cool evening air. There were questions I still wanted to ask, boundaries still to be established, history still to be examined, but in that moment, the weight of all that unfinished business felt less pressing than it had before the dinner. "Good night, Dominic," I said finally, using his first name as I had throughout our professional collaboration. He nodded, accepting the continued distance implied by the formal address. "Good night, Willow. Drive safely." As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror to see him still standing there, watching until my taillights disappeared around the corner. A parent ensuring their child's safe departure, a simple gesture that stirred unexpected emotion in my chest. My phone chimed with a text as I waited at a stoplight. From Alex. "So that wasn't too painful, right? Welcome to the weird Richards family circus. P.S. Dad's already researching kayaking safety statistics. Expect detailed questions about your life vest policies." The message startled a laugh from me, both the easy presumption of continued connection and the insight into my father's protective tendencies. It was a glimpse behind the composed professional exterior I'd encountered at Palmer, a reminder that the CEO was also a father who worried about his children's safety, perhaps even the daughter he was only beginning to know again. I tapped out a quick reply. "Life vests are non-negotiable in my kayak. Tell him his safety concerns are noted and respected." It was a small thing, this acknowledgement of parental concern, this acceptance of caring as a natural right rather than an intrusion. Yet as I drove home through Seattle's evening traffic, it felt like a significant shift in the careful boundaries I'd maintained since my father's return to my life. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps the first tentative steps toward understanding, toward possibility, as he would say. The Richardson integration project consumed the following weeks, technical challenges demanding full professional focus as we approached the launch deadline. Working closely with my father in this high-pressure context revealed dimensions of his character I might never have discovered in more casual interaction. His unflappable calm during system crises, his willingness to take responsibility for mistakes rather than seeking scapegoats, his genuine appreciation for innovative solutions regardless of their source within the team hierarchy. These qualities earned my professional respect independent of our personal connection, and perhaps began to rebuild a foundation for the trust that had been damaged by his long absence from my life. We maintained clear boundaries during work. Hours, referring to each other by title and last name, focusing exclusively on project parameters rather than personal matters. It was only during occasional after-hours strategy sessions that the lines blurred slightly, fatigue sometimes softening the formal distance we'd established. During this period, I met with Alex twice for the promised kayaking excursions, outings. That proved surprisingly enjoyable, despite the inherent awkwardness of getting to know a sibling in adulthood. My half-brother approached our developing relationship with uncomplicated enthusiasm, treating our connection as established fact rather than tenuous possibility. His straightforward acceptance made it easier to relax into the interaction, to discover shared traits that transcended our different upbringings, a dry sense of humor, a tendency toward analytical problem-solving, an appreciation for outdoor challenges. "You definitely got the Richard stubbornness gene," he observed as we paddled back toward the dock after our second outing. "Dad calls it persistence in the face of obstacles, but Mom says that's just fancy rebranding of pure, mule-headed determination." I laughed, recognizing the trait in myself. My mother always called it unhealthy obsession with proving a point. Not quite as charitable a spin. "Speaking of your mom," Alex ventured, testing waters more treacherous than the lake we were crossing, "is she completely opposed to this whole reconnection thing?" Dad's been pretty vague about her reaction. The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because I deliberately avoided examining my mother's response too closely. "She's processing," I hedged. "It's complicated for her." Alex nodded, accepting the minimal answer without pressing further. "Family stuff usually is. I just wondered if she might eventually be open to meeting us too. No pressure either way." The suggestion that my mother might someday interact civilly with my father's second family seemed so implausible that I nearly laughed aloud. Yet the genuine openness in Alex's question made mockery feel inappropriate. "I wouldn't count on it," I said instead. "Some bridges are pretty thoroughly burned." 2 days before the Richardson system integration was scheduled to go live, a major security vulnerability was discovered in the core protocol, a flaw that could potentially expose client data during the transition period. The project team gathered in the main conference room, tension palpable as my father reviewed the technical assessment I'd prepared. "The vulnerability exists in the handshake between our primary authentication layer and Richardson's legacy verification system," I explained, highlighting the relevant code section on the projector. "During the microsecond delay between credential verification and session establishment, there's a window where data packets are effectively unprotected. Can we patch it before Friday's launch?" Marcus asked, concern evident in his expression. As my direct supervisor, he'd been supportive of my project leadership role despite the unusual reporting structure. I hesitated, glancing at my father, who nodded for me to continue with my assessment. "Not without compromising system performance? Beyond acceptable parameters," I admitted. "The fix requires redesigning the authentication handshake process from scratch. 2 weeks of work at minimum." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Delaying the integration would have significant business impacts, contractual penalties, market reaction, internal resource reallocation. Yet proceeding with a known security vulnerability violated both Palmer's corporate values and my own professional ethics. "We have no choice but to delay the launch," my father said finally, his decision immediate and unhesitating despite the business consequences. "Security integrity takes precedence over timeline commitments." Relief washed through me. I had prepared arguments defending this position, anticipating resistance from the business-focused executives. That my father had reached the same conclusion without debate confirmed the alignment in our professional values that had been developing throughout the project. "Willow will lead the redesign team," he continued, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Marcus, please work with PR to prepare appropriate client communications. We'll position this as a proactive security enhancement rather than a vulnerability remediation." The meeting dispersed with clear directives, team members moving purposefully despite the setback. My father gestured for me to remain as others, filed out, waiting until we were alone before speaking. "Good catch," he said simply. "Many engineers would have missed that vulnerability or convinced themselves it was an acceptable risk given the timeline pressure." I can't take full credit, I admitted. Priya was the one who identified the potential packet exposure during final testing. He nodded, unsurprised by my unwillingness to claim unearned recognition. Then please extend my appreciation to her as well. This is precisely why Palmer's security team has the reputation it does. Integrity and attention to detail, even when identifying problems creates short-term business challenges. His praise, delivered as one professional to another, rather than as father to daughter, carried particular weight, acknowledgement of values we apparently shared despite our years of separation. In that moment, I glimpsed something I hadn't fully appreciated before. How my professional identity, which I'd believed was constructed in deliberate contrast to my absent father, might actually reflect inherited traits I'd never recognized. Vulnerability remediation consumed the next 2 weeks, intensive coding sessions and system architecture revisions requiring round-the-clock effort from the integration team. Throughout this period, my father was consistently present, not micromanaging but providing necessary resources, clearing bureaucratic obstacles, and occasionally delivering midnight pizza to engineers working through complex debugging challenges. The evening before the rescheduled launch, with the security fix finally implemented and verified through multiple testing protocols, he stopped by my office where I was reviewing the final deployment sequence. "The board is extremely pleased with how you've handled this situation," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Identifying the vulnerability, designing the fix, managing the team through the adjustment period. It's been exemplary leadership." I glanced up from my monitor, fatigue momentarily overriding my usual caution about personal topics in the workplace. "Would you be saying that if I weren't your daughter?" He didn't flinch at the directness of the question. "I'd be saying it to any project lead who performed as you have. The fact that you're my daughter means I've had the privilege of witnessing your capabilities firsthand rather than receiving reports through management layers. But the assessment would be the same." The straightforward response, delivered without defensiveness, eased something in my chest that had been tight since the vulnerability discovery. "Thank you," I said simply, "for backing the delay decision without hesitation. Some executives would have calculated the risk differently." "Some executives haven't spent their careers in security architecture," he countered. "The momentary business impact of a delay is nothing compared to the potential damage of a data breach, both to our clients and to Palmer's reputation." This alignment in our professional values, this shared understanding that technical integrity must sometimes override business expediency, created a bridge between us that personal conversation might never have built. It was, I realized, exactly what he had hoped for in arranging our professional collaboration, common ground upon which a more personal connection might eventually be constructed. The system integration launched successfully the following day, the security vulnerability fully remediated, the transition proceeding without incident. The technical achievement was celebrated throughout Palmer Technologies, with particular recognition for the project team's commitment to security excellence even at the cost of timeline adjustment. In the aftermath, as the intensity of the project work subsided to more normal operational oversight, I found myself at an unexpected crossroads in my relationship with my father. The professional foundation had been firmly established, mutual respect, shared values, collaborative success. The question that remained was whether I was willing to build upon that foundation in the personal realm. The decision crystallized unexpectedly during a conversation with my mother, who had finally succeeded in arranging a dinner meeting after weeks of my polite deflection. Seated across from her at an upscale restaurant she'd selected for its discretion, I listened as she probed for details about the project completion and my continuing interactions with Dominic and his London family, as she referred to them. "I understand you've been spending time with the boy," she remarked, her tone casual, though her eyes were sharp with assessment. "Alexander, is it?" "Alex," I corrected automatically. "And yes, we've gone kayaking a few times. He's interesting company." She sipped her wine, studying me over the rim of her glass. "Fascinating. How quickly Dominic has managed to integrate you into his replacement family. One might almost admire the strategic execution. The characterization, so at odds with the genuine, unpressured connections that had been developing, ignited a flash of irritation. There's been no strategic execution, Mom. Just people getting to know each other without manipulation or agenda. Oh, Willow. She set down her glass with deliberate precision. There's always an agenda where Dominic is concerned. The man doesn't take a breath without calculating its impact on his objectives. The assessment struck me as both unfair and strangely revealing, not of my father, but of my mother's fundamental worldview. In her experience, all interactions were tactical, all relationships transactional. It was the lens through which she had always viewed her own life, including her relationship with me. Maybe that's how you operate, I said quietly. But I've seen no evidence it's how Dad approaches his family relationships. The word slipped out unplanned. Dad, rather than Dominic or my father. A small linguistic shift that represented a much larger internal movement. My mother didn't miss it, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. So we've progressed to Dad now, she observed, a bitter note underlying her measured tone. How touching. And what role has he assigned you in this newly constructed family tableau? The prodigal daughter, returned to the fold, the professional protégé, following in his distinguished footsteps? He hasn't assigned me any role, I countered, increasingly certain of this truth. He simply offered connection on whatever terms I'm comfortable accepting. And you believe that's without condition? Without expectation of return on his emotional investment? She laughed, the sound brittle in the quiet restaurant. My dear, you're an intelligent woman in most respects, but remarkably naive when it comes to Dominic Richards. I studied her across the table. This woman who had shaped my childhood with both loving attention and calculated control, who had believed she was protecting me by managing my relationship with my father, who had made decisions on my behalf that I was still struggling to unravel in adulthood. I think, I said carefully, that I'm done letting other people define my relationships for me, whether that's Dad trying to connect through shared professional interests, or you trying to prevent connection through warnings about his supposed ulterior motives. Her expression shifted, something vulnerable briefly visible beneath her composed exterior. I've only ever wanted to protect you from disappointment, Willow, from the pain of investing in a relationship with a man who has proven he can walk away when circumstances require it. The sincerity in her voice gave me pause, a reminder that despite her controlling tendencies, my mother's concern for my well-being was genuine, if often misapplied. I appreciate that, I acknowledged. But I'm 32 years old. I can assess risks and make my own decisions about which relationships are worth pursuing. Even knowing he may leave again? Return to London once the initial novelty of reconnection fades. She leaned forward, her expression intent. Dominic has built his life elsewhere, Willow. This Seattle interlude is temporary, a midlife attempt to reconcile loose ends before returning to his real family. The suggestion stung, touching on fears I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Would my father's interest wane once the professional project concluded? Was this reconnection merely a time-limited experiment rather than a lasting commitment? If that happens, I'll handle it, I said, with more confidence than I felt, but I'm not going to preemptively reject connection based on what might go wrong. My mother sat back, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You've changed, she said finally. Since he returned. I've gained perspective, I corrected. About the past, about the choices both of you made, about the story I've been telling myself about who I am and why. She nodded slowly, a flash of something like respect crossing her features despite her evident disapproval of my choices. You always were stubbornly independent, determined to form your own conclusions regardless of my guidance. Perhaps I should have expected this outcome. The acknowledgement of my autonomy, however reluctantly offered, felt like a small victory in our complicated relationship. "I'm not rejecting your perspective, Mom," I said, softening my tone. "I'm just integrating additional data, forming a more complete picture." A hint of a smile touched her lips at my technical phrasing. Ever the engineer, analyzing family dynamics like system architecture? "It's the toolkit I have," I acknowledged with a small answering smile. As our dinner concluded and we parted with our usual formal embrace, I felt a subtle shift in our dynamic. Not resolution of our fundamental differences, but perhaps a nascent recognition that my relationship with my father could exist independently of her narrative about our family history. It was a small step toward the adult relationship we had never quite managed to establish, one based on mutual respect rather than her continued authority over my choices. Later that evening, I found myself composing a text message to my father. "The lighthouse in Maine. Tell me more about why you thought I'd like it there." His response came quickly. "It stands alone on a rocky promontory, independent and resilient against storms, consistent in purpose despite isolation, beautiful in its functionality rather than decorative flourishes. When I visited years ago, I thought, this reminds me of Willow." The simple description, this perception of me formed from afar, apparently accurate despite our separation, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. He had seen me, or some version of me, even in absence, had thought of me when encountering places and experiences I might appreciate, had maintained some internal connection despite the external barriers. "I'm free this weekend," I wrote back after a moment's consideration. "If you'd like to have dinner, just us this time." "I'd like that very much," came the immediate reply. Then, after a brief pause, "Thank you, Willow, for the possibility." As I set aside my phone, I realized I had crossed some internal threshold, from reluctant reconnection to cautious openness, from defensive distance to tentative engagement. The path forward remained uncertain, the relationship still fragile with unresolved history and unclaimed years. But for the first time since my father's return to my life, I found myself genuinely curious about what might develop if I allowed this connection to grow on its own terms, not as replacement for lost time, but as something new constructed from the materials at hand. The Richardson Integration Project had successfully merged two separate systems into a functioning whole, creating something stronger and more effective than either had been independently. Perhaps I allowed myself to hope a similar integration might be possible in the personal realm, not erasing the past or its impacts, but building something meaningful from elements that had once seemed irreconcilably separated. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was perhaps the beginning of understanding, and for now that seemed enough to build upon.